Good afternoon. Let me begin by sharing some recent advice given to young women by two prominent journalists. Dear female grads, you've learned how to be perfect. Now change. You've learned to play by the rules, to impress, to please, and to be well-liked. Now take everything that you've been taught and forget it. The real world requires an entirely different skill set. Why would two successful women, Claire Shipman and Katty Kay, advise graduates to, quote, drive a stake through perfection? Or encourage young women to fail, but fail fast? Or launch their careers by doing more and thinking less? Isn't it cruel to nudge your friends into action rather than providing them a shoulder to cry on? Why would Claire and Katie say these things? For most of us here today, graduation may be just a memory, or in my case, a very, very fuzzy memory. But even the most powerful women in the world can use a wake-up call. After spending 2 decades interviewing the female titans of industry and politics, Claire and Katty began to notice a surprisingly common pattern among these women, a pattern of self-reproach and fear. They decided to find out what was holding these women back, and it turns out that the answer is something our male counterparts have known, perhaps instinctively, for ages. Confidence, not just competence, is the key to success. In the United States, women now earn more advanced degrees than men. We make up 50% of the workforce. Female-driven companies are outpacing their male-dominated competitors. Our competence has never been more clear, and yet confident men still get paid more, and they commandeer the boardrooms. There may be a confidence gap for now, but as Claire and Katty detail in their newly released book, The Confidence Code, there is hope. My name is Linda Myers, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm a partner in Kirkland's Debt Finance practice and a member of our firm-wide Global Management Committee. I'm also married, and I have 3 children. I'm a founding member of our Women's Leadership Initiative, or as we like to call it around here, our WLI, which supports and advances women at Kirkland and beyond. Like many of you participating today, I've struggled with self-doubt throughout my entire career. And so I'm thrilled to kick off our discussion today on how confidence affects women in the workplace and to introduce our featured guests, Confidence Code co-author Claire Shipman and one of our very favorite collaborators, Debbie Epstein Henry. I would also like to welcome our audience members here at Kirkland, New York, and across the globe on our webcast. Since 2001, Claire Shipman has been a regular contributor to Good Morning America and other national broadcasts for ABC News. She regularly interviews newsmakers, including former Presidents George Bush and Bill Clinton, former U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Queen Rania of Jordan, former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, and many, many others. Claire also spent 5 years reporting from Moscow for CNN. She holds a bachelor's degree in international affairs from Columbia and a Bachelor of Arts in Russian Studies from Columbia, where she graduated magna cum laude. She currently is a Columbia University trustee. She resides in Washington, D.C. with her husband and her 2 children. We are very fortunate to have Debbie Epstein Henry to lead the discussion with Claire, and when I asked Debbie for her thoughts on confidence, she shared with me that now that her 3 kids are older, her focus has broadened from work-life balance to address issues of ambition, perfectionism, and promotion. I have had the pleasure of partnering with Debbie on a number of projects, and I know firsthand that she is a great ally for women in their pursuit of confidence. Debbie attended Yale College and Brooklyn Law School cum laude, and she is a former practicing litigator. She is the president of FlexTime Lawyers, a firm she founded to provide consulting, training, and speaking services to law firms, companies, and not-for-profits. She is well known for running the Best Law Firms for Women initiative with Working Mother magazine, and is the co-author of Finding Bliss, Innovative Legal Models for Happy Clients and Happy Lawyers, a book on the future of the profession and realigning the effective delivery of legal services and career paths. Finding Bliss was literally just released last week by the ABA. Her first book, Law and Reorder, was the #1 best-selling ABA flagship publishing book for 2011. Now, before we begin today's discussion, I have just a few housekeeping items I want to cover. Number one, we do have some members of the press here today, And we want to make sure we don't inhibit the conversation. So we have asked that if they want to report on anything with attribution, they seek permission first. Second, all remarks today are attributable to individual speakers only and not to any particular organization. For those of you who are participating in New York, we're going to open up the floor to questions immediately after the discussion. Unfortunately, we can't take questions from the webcast, so instead we encourage you to join the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag #ShipmanLawReorder. And our program is going to wrap up at 2 o'clock Eastern today. So now, please join me in welcoming Claire and Debbie.
So Linda, let me start by just thanking you so much, and of course thanking Kirkland for hosting this incredible event today. I feel privileged to not only call you a colleague, Linda, but also a dear friend, and I will do my proper thank yous of Kirkland at the end of the program, but just really to say how delighted I am to be here and to have the opportunity to collaborate again with Claire. We had the pleasure of being introduced, I think, initially through a mutual friend, Diane Lazarus, a classmate of mine from Yale, who said, "Oh, Claire, interview Debbie for your first book, Womenomics." So that was such a treat, and thank you, Diana, who I think is listening. And then we collaborated for Best Law Firms for Women event, and then I guess the most recent was you interviewed me for my first book. I know that was an abbreviated bio, so next to Clinton and Bush and those other names, it didn't say me, but my confidence is not impeded by that. I'm totally fine with it. And on the subject of confidence, I'm so relieved that I read Claire's book before today's presentation because it's a little intimidating to interview a Good Morning America anchor. So I'm all good. And I am testament to confidence can be taught. So we're going to get right to the subject. So with that, Claire, I really want to start with your inspiration for this book. And I know you talk a little bit in your acknowledgments about hearing Marie Wilson speak and how that just sort of was a triggering event with you. So could you start with that and really why you and Kathy decided to delve into this confidence project?
Well, it is funny because we were, after Womenomics, we were starting to, as you were, I mean, we sort of were on the circuit of women in leadership and workplace flexibility and work-life balance and going to a lot of these events. And there was an event we went to in the basement of Capitol Hill where Marie Wilson, who used to run the White House Women's Project, just made the most startling and obvious comment, but it really affected us, where she said she was talking about the difficulty of getting women to run for office. And she said it boils down to this: when a man looks in the mirror, he naturally sees, looking back at him, a senator. Women are never that presumptuous. We would never presume that that's the case. But in fact, all it takes is one person that woman knows or trusts to say, you should consider this, and the process starts. And we were really struck by that. And in addition, frankly, we were struck by what we noted after a lot of our research for Womenomics and our own work as broadcasters, as Linda mentioned, just that there were so many powerful women we had interviewed over the course of especially our book research who would say to us almost incidentally, you know, well, I'm about to get a big promotion, but I don't really think I'm qualified. Or my bosses want me to do this, but I'm not sure I'm ready. I don't know that. And it struck us because these were women in already really powerful positions. And we could, you know, Katty and I had known we would occasionally feel like a fraud or an imposter, but we started joking about how often the F word, as we came to call it, would come up, the fraud word, and just from women who seemed, who we would not have expected to feel that way. And I think that was the kernel, but then we dug into the research and the data, because we thought, well, is this just an urban legend? Is this something women say to each other? Or is there data behind this idea that there's maybe a confidence gap? And there's a lot of data. And that's when we knew we have a book.
Right. And the book is so rich with that data. But a lot of what you first do in the book, and what I want to sort of make sure we put out there, is what confidence means. A lot of us feel like it's something like almost like executive presence. You know it when you see it. And you use so many different terms throughout the book in terms of defining it. And I just want to mention a few: ability, mastery, hard work, action, risk, persistence, failure, grit, tolerance for hardship, etc. And so before we sort of dig down in the topic, I want to get a better sense from you is, you know, where are the focal points with all of those different things, and particularly with some of those terms that, you know, failure and mastery, that seem somewhat contradictory. How do you come out in terms of what confidence means?
Well, that was a really hard part of the book. Let me just say this book was this was hard for us to do. So we had a lot of mastery and failure experiences just in writing the book, because there's so much science, there's so much hard science and psychological science behind what we were trying to do. And we thought, we thought exactly what you said. Well, you know it when you see it. We both thought, we know what we're talking about here with confidence. And then we started to try to define it for ourselves, and we realized actually what we thought of as confidence is really more self-esteem. So we were wrong right from the start. We thought self-esteem, which is the sense you have value as a person and you are valuable, we kind of thought that was confidence. It turns out that's not confidence. And this won't surprise you when you try to talk to academics around the country about what confidence is. There isn't always agreement. So we were just going through the thicket of experts trying to sort it out. But when we pulled the pieces together and we really reached a definition that we think is most useful for us and women, I think the one professor put it most succinctly for us, a professor at Ohio State University, and he said, confidence is the stuff that turns our thoughts into action. And really, there was an enormous amount of agreement about confidence and action, and this really surprised us. And I think that's very important for women, because first of all, because we're really good at thinking, right? We think, we have all these thoughts, but there sometimes is a hesitation and a gap before we act, and maybe we don't always act on what is in our heads. But what he explained is that confidence is almost the fuel for us to do things, and it necessarily involves a certain amount of risk. And the other wonderful thing about confidence is that it's almost a virtuous circle when you are creating confidence, because what creates confidence is the very stuff that it's the same as what manifests it, the taking action, the failing, ultimately the mastery. It's that experience that then creates a reservoir of confidence for you to be able to act on things the next time. So this is what really struck me. I couldn't say to you, what? How could you have a confidence problem? You are this. You should feel that way, right? I think as women, we all feel we should be able to just tell people, you shouldn't feel this way, you should feel that way, and the reassurance will create confidence. Confidence comes from our own experiences and what we have mastered and failed, and then therefore the sense we take that stuff and then we can say, oh, all right, I accomplished this worked out, there were some failures along the way, but now I can know I can do this. And without the doing, we're not building confidence. And I think that's what was so important for women especially.
But I want to push back a little bit on that, because I know, particularly with the women in my community who've stopped working, when I've seen them in a volunteer platform, there's nobody who can stand in their way, and they're running that PTA meeting or that board meeting or school board meeting, whatever it may be. And then they are thinking about going back to work maybe, and they're in a professional venue, and they're a shell of themselves. And so I want to stick with that a little bit and say, how can that be? How do we have that empowerment through our action, and sort of there's this reservoir, as you say, and then how do we make sure that we can transfer it in settings where we may not be as confident, like the example I provided?
Well, I think that there's, the fact is, the reason we have a confidence gap isn't always because we don't necessarily act and we're not building our own confidence. So there are a lot of it, and I know we're going to get into some of this later, but the very fact that, for example, reason number one is the workplace isn't a level playing field. Right? So that has enormous consequences for our confidence. That's a very real thing. There are good reasons why we don't always feel as confident as men do in the workplace, and it doesn't always have to do with something that comes internally. And so the fact is, the workplace, it was created by men, and the values that exist in the workplace are often still very much male values. So there's a good reason, there's just loads of data on stereotype threat. When we're in a situation where we're one of a very few women, one of a very few African American women, one of a very, any minority feels less confident and less able to perform in a situation where they're one of a few. So there's just a lot of internal reasons why you might have been excelling doing things at the PTA or in a volunteer capacity, but you don't feel that those things are going to translate naturally into the work environment. So that's just one, but, and we should talk about this later too. I mean, there's a lot of, our perfectionism, our rumination, the fact that we just aren't quite judging ourselves accurately is all very important.
Right, and we're going to come to that, and that is our first real mention of men, and I want to just pause and acknowledge and really applaud the men who were brave enough to attend. My dad and my uncle were unavailable today, so I'm really grateful that we've got at least a handful. I know on the webcast, many of you are there as well, so thank you, and we'll come back to you, don't worry. I want to actually switch gears a little bit and ask you about one of sort of the big surprises in the book, and that was this relationship between competence for women and confidence. I know particularly in the piece that ran in the Atlantic Monthly, that was something that was underscored as well as in the book. So could you talk about that interplay for women between competence and confidence?
Well, that really surprised us. And actually, when we started getting into that research, that was something I thought, this is just too depressing. I don't really want to include this in the book, except that we're journalists, and so we felt we really needed to include it. But there's a researcher out at Berkeley, Cameron Anderson, who's been doing studies on the relative value of competence and confidence. And I remember reading Caddy's notes because she interviewed him first. And when I first read it, I thought, oh, there's Caddy. She just wasn't very accurate. She actually transposed all of the information because he's saying in many cases that confidence is more valuable than competence for success. And I thought that is just ridiculous. Because, of course, women, we're all about competence. Right. We just want to get everything right. We think that is the ultimate value. And it was so hard to believe. We called him again. And sure enough, no, what he's finding in these studies is that in many cases, confidence trumps competence. And what he's doing is he's measuring his graduate students at the beginning of the term or of the year with a kind of fake history exam. And you just have to tick off the events you recognize, but he throws in ringers like Murphy's Last Ride or Queen's Shadow, things that didn't happen. And there are a lot of people who are really familiar with those historical events, as it turns out. But he follows these overconfident students over the course of the year because they're all they're working together in study groups and on projects. And at the end of the year, according to their fellow students, these overconfident students tended to be the ones who are viewed as more leaders, whose ideas are listened to more. They have more influence in their groups. And we found this really dismaying. But I have to say that a couple of silver linings. One, the gap between your confidence and your competence can't be too big because then that's really a disastrous result. But the other thing is, and this gets to pulling the men in a little bit, is that because in many cases it was the men who displayed more overconfidence, this was it has to be genuine overconfidence, right? It's not bravado. So this is a genuine belief that you are more capable, really, than you are. And it may not be by much, it's not necessarily a bad thing, I will tell you. Columbia University has done some studies on this, the business school, and they call it honest overconfidence because they found that in general, men tend to believe they're about 30% more able to do something than they are. And women, and this gets back to the data that we talked about. Women, on the other hand, we routinely underestimate what we're capable of. You mentioned some of that data. That was Hewlett-Packard has done this study. They've done it. The academics have done this study that show that, you give men and women an exam. Women will routinely, before they know how they've done, underestimate how they've done. Men overestimate, and the scores are almost always about the same. And I think it's so important because if we're doing that on an everyday basis, not just taking exams, but judging our writing, our ability to say something in a meeting. Women are just always erring this way.
I'm just thinking how much I wish I knew this, dating, actually. Invaluable,
yes.
Now
the
raising three
chapter.
sons, I have enormous wisdom, but it's too late. In any case, What really, I think, has fueled the tremendous interest in this book has been this nature versus nurture concept. You know, is this confidence thing something we're born with? Can it be cultivated? And if so, how? So can you dig into that? And I think there are going to be some cynics among us that, okay, well, even if it can be taught, well, how much, really? Because again, coming back to my initial question, it's a lot of it is, you know it when you see it. So talk, if you will, about how confidence can be taught and how you really understand that to be.
Well, you know, this week, once we started to look at all of this data, and I just want to give you one more example because of the data before I get into the sort of nature versus nurture, because this one we found really compelling. Zach Estes, another researcher who's been studying confidence directly, and this just kind of pulls together this link I mentioned between action and confidence. He decided to test spatial ability in men and women, and typically spatial ability, by the way, has been one area in IQ tests where men have scored better. Women tend to do better on the verbal reasoning, men on the spatial ability. So he used this first group, the men scored better than the women, but he looked at what had happened when he started looking at the scores in detail. He realized the women were skipping a lot of the questions. When they didn't know, they were skipping. They weren't answering, right? He told the next group, everybody has to answer all of the questions. The scores were almost identical.
So interesting.
So again, that link between sort of the doubt and the willingness to take a risk or act or however you want to put it, I think is so important. And so then we sort of thought, all right, is there some gene that men have that we just don't have that is enabling this kind of assessment of abilities or risk taking? What is this? And we kind of set off on the science part, by the way, thinking, oh, well, let's look at the genetics, but clearly we're not going to find that confidence is genetic. That's kind of preposterous. I think we thought it's probably something that's really heavily nurtured by parents. And by the time you're 10, you either sort of have it or you don't. Well, confidence is partly genetic. We talked to people who are studying confidence in rats, confidence in monkeys, as well as confidence in humans. And there's a lot of evidence that there are a number of genes that really do affect our confidence from birth. Some things we're born with. Some scientists estimate it's between 25 and 50% inherited. So, and the genes that come into play are things, for example, you probably know some of these, that affect neurotransmitters in our brains like serotonin, oxytocin, and dopamine. And at a certain point, this evidence was coming in, and Caddy and I thought, oh God, this is brilliant, because we're both TV reporters. We thought, let's get our own genes tested, and this will be so great for the book, and we'll find out, are we naturally confident or not? And it's not that hard to do now to get your own genes tested, unfortunately. And so we spit into the tube and we sent it off. And it turns out after a lot of sort of, you get really nervous. It's like getting your SAT scores back after we did it. We thought, what if we don't like what we find, even though we're both, 50, we still want to, like what our genetic makeup is. And as it turns out, we're both genetic basket cases when it comes to confidence. So of course because we're women, we spent a lot of time hand-wringing thinking we'd failed a test and we had done something wrong and ruminating about it. And then we realized, though, I think the other part of the equation, which is that, look, we both have confidence issues. We talk about them in the book, very, different varieties. But we've learned over time to be more confident. And I think that's what we realized is that, we're seeing the other part of this confidence equation, which is, all right, maybe part of it is hereditary, but part of it is something you can actually cultivate and learn. And I think that was the exciting part of the brain science for us, which is all the science on brain plasticity. And because, it's not, you can say, oh, look, read Cosmopolitan magazine, and if you sit up straight and if you do this, and you're going to be more confident. But what's wonderful about what's going on in the science is now you can see why. You can see those changes happening, that you can see the new, you can see the way you can reprogram your brain, new connections being made with fairly simple changes in habit. And so I think that was the exciting piece of the puzzle for us. But I will say that the last word on this nature versus nurture is that, the genetic part, when I'm talking about the neurotransmitters, that was pretty evenly distributed, the genes among men and women and serotonin. But we did see some big differences in terms of the way our brains function. So, and when I say big, I mean in terms of confidence, because cognitively they're basically the same. But the fact is, when you dig into the way our brains work, women have a lot more matter that we use in our prefrontal cortex, which is the home of analytical thinking and caution and sort of thinking things through. Now they see from all these scans that our brains seem more active at any given moment.
I think our husband says that's an actual test
exactly.
to that,
and I was going to say, usually you think, oh, well, that's good. And then you think, well, maybe not so good, because it is, a lot of scientists think that that is the sort of visual evidence now of what they've known women do for a long time, which is this ruminating. And ruminating can be, thinking is a great thing, but when it becomes overthinking and ruminating, it can actually be a debilitating thing, and especially so for action, right? You're thinking, you're overanalyzing. Some people call it analysis paralysis, and then you're actually just not doing. And then finally, there's also a part of our brain, by the way, that's called the Worrywarts Center. Scientists have dubbed the Worrywarts Center. It's the home of sort of, looking for threats, sort of being cautious. It's literally bigger in the female brain than it is in the male brain. So there's stuff there. And then, we have to mention testosterone. Testosterone there have been so many studies on this. Testosterone is a huge boost for risk-taking behavior. Men have 10 times more testosterone coursing through their bodies than women do. And it makes a difference. There's really interesting data on that. Estrogen, on the other hand, promotes it promotes negotiating, conciliating, problem solving. A lot of the things, by the way, that as you've written about, I've written about, are incredibly valuable in today's workplace. But it doesn't necessarily help to promote risk-taking. Right. And so I think that's something important to keep in mind.
So assuming you have us convinced that at least part of this confidence can actually be cultivated through experience and otherwise, we still need to acknowledge that it's quite uncomfortable. It causes a lot of anxiety for many of us to push ourselves to sort of project that confident image. So I guess I want to ask really, actually I should say that in a more confident way. I want to ask you, what do we leave on the table when we don't push for that confidence? Really, what's the risk here to us if we don't push through that discomfort and anxiety?
I think there's just so many missed opportunities. They're hard to measure but you can imagine, what struck us was every woman we interviewed. We interviewed business professors at Yale who would say to us, I send out for publication probably 1/5 of the amount of papers that my male colleagues do, because I'm so focused on making sure that it's all right, it's all perfect, and I'm sending it to the right place. And in the meantime, my colleagues are just sending it everywhere, so their hit rate is a lot bigger. And guess what? Your career is based heavily on publication if you're an academic. So, and I think we can all translate for our whatever practice you're in what that means when you're deciding you need to spend, here's how I think it looks. Let me put this a different way, because it surprised me to think about what a lack of confidence can look like, right? So it's not always somebody who's shy and retiring and not going to the mat for herself. Lack of confidence can look like perfectionism, as you mentioned earlier. It can look like somebody who just wants to get everything right so much all the time that she's not willing to take risks. So it doesn't necessarily mean you're not successful, but it does mean that you may be reaching a certain level, but you're not going to the next level, because ultimately, in all of these careers, you need to be willing to take a certain amount of risk. You need to be comfortable doing stuff you don't know how to do yet.
Right. So along those lines, let's get very tangible here. What are some concrete steps that are things that we could all do to really move towards projecting more confidence?
I think that what we found is that the most important for women, and I want to just say one other piece, and I think it'll put this in perspective for you in terms of our prescriptives, because we were struck, by the way, at all right, well, if women are struggling so much with confidence, why are girls doing so well in school? Right? What is the missing link here? Because if you look at all these girls, and we talked about this with the graduation when you introduced me, they're just it's all this sort of they're acing everything. I mean, when you look at, it's the boys who people are worried about in terms of getting into college and getting through high school. And what we realized in Carol Dweck, I don't know how many of you have read her great book, Mindset, but what she said to us essentially is if life were one long grade school, women would rule the world, right? But it's not, and it's nothing like that. And the rules change significantly. And what women are not getting enough of as girls is failure and learning to take risks. Because from a very early age, we are very, very good at sitting still, coloring within the lines, doing everything right, acing spelling tests, getting all the homework done on time, pleasing people. And let's be honest, a lot of us here might be parents, or we know, I mean, who doesn't want that from your kids? If you're a teacher or a parent, we encourage that behavior, and pretty soon the girls/women start to feel really valuable for that very behavior, which is just perfectionism and people pleasing. And boys, on the other hand, are learning early on they can fail, they can annoy people, they can screw up, and because it just comes more naturally early. And guess what? But they learn. But they're learning it's okay, right? They don't have to please people all the time. If they fail, they move on. And so that's all to say, that's just a precursor to say, we have to get more comfortable with failure. We must become more comfortable stepping outside of our comfort zone. And some of the best remedies we've seen, or I should say steps for building confidence, really have to do with almost cognitive behavioral therapy techniques toward just getting used to risk-taking, just acclimating ourselves very slowly to taking risks. So some of the things you can do are just involve looking at what feels the most risky to you. And it could be anything. It's so different for everybody. For some people, it's speaking up in a meeting. For some people, it's going to be turning something in before we think it's perfect. But you've got to identify what seem to be the riskiest, most frightening thing, and you have to start biting those off bit by bit and trying them and learning that it's okay. For some people, I mean, we've talked to a couple of people who say part of leadership is about being able to make a lot of decisions and move through them pretty quickly. And that can be really hard for women to do who are perfectionists, because we want to get all of these decisions right all the time. So one woman said she's realized that, well, a lawyer who told us in the book, I just realized I have to move through so many decisions in a day. I've decided, tell myself 10% of my decisions will be wrong. But I've accepted that, and I know I'll just deal with the consequences because I just need to get through the other stuff. So I think for everybody it's different, but pushing ourselves to get used to risk-taking is huge.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. And just to stick with this whole girl thing for a moment, what I think is actually sort of complicated, you talk a lot about this good girl message in the book and how we have to move away from that. What I find, and particularly women who are my, sort of age, Gen X, find this as well, it seems, is that we were actually really very much raised with mixed messages. So, I mean, literally, and my sisters in the audience, my parents called me affectionately good girl pussycat. Like, literally, that's how I was known. I mean, it's unbelievable. I just revealed that publicly. But,
hashtag.
Yeah, exactly. Please don't hashtag it. But then on the other end of the spectrum, like, Free to Be You and Me was streaming through our house my whole childhood. And we had, are you too young to know what Free to Be You and Me is? I mean, anyway, just push towards sports, all that sort of stuff. So there was completely these mixed messages. Oh, you can do everything. You're just as good as those boys out there or better. And so my question really is, in raising daughters today, how do they reconcile these mixed messages? Because they're really, getting torn up on a lot of these things. And
that's what I think is so striking, is that we're, just as you said, even today, I mean, no girl thinks that, I can't grow up and do what I want to do, because the messaging is all there in terms of possibility, but it's in the everyday behavior we encourage that we're not giving our daughters the right tools. So I think all of the psychologists we talked to said as much opportunity for failure as possible early, and encouraging, especially for girls. For my son, I try to discourage failure because he's always, it's so funny to watch, right? He's always like, Mom, that went so well. And I was like, but really? But look, not really, but okay. And I think just giving them the opportunity to take risks, and also, but guide them through mastery experiences, which sounds very, I don't know what.
Heady,
yes. Yoga-like, or I don't know what it sounds like, but look for areas where they are going to learn something that won't be easy and they can struggle with it. And ultimately, literally, it can be frying an egg, walking to take the bus by yourself. it could be anything, but just try to, we all hover so much, and I'm as guilty as the next person because we want everything to go so well. And for girls especially, that's not healthy. And a lot of experts have said competitive sports, and this is kind of obvious, but competitive sports are just so important for girls because it gives them the opportunities that they're not creating naturally on their own to fail and learn to lose and just lose and get up again and get over it. And also just to be aggressive with each other, that you're not going to please everybody all the time. You can't be nice all the time, and that's okay. And I was really surprised that the data is that girls are still dropping out of competitive sports around puberty at 6 times the rate boys are. So despite Title IX and everything we see in the Olympics and women, and it all looks so great, the reality is girls aren't sticking with it at a critical point when they would need it.
And then there's the particularly vexing problem with girls, and the mothers in the room, I think, are experiencing it. And certainly the mothers of sons who are hopefully going to have granddaughters one day are thinking about it. What about tone and inflection and the upspeak and sort of that women, the girls have, that I want to be a lawyer, just all those questions that they pose, like, I really want this job. And you're sort of like, do you? I'm not sure. Are we Valley Girl again? What is this? But I think, how do we clue in girls about how much they're projecting in their tone, in the way they dress, in their physical postures, and how do we have time for this? This is a long one.
It's like, wow, it's funny because we focus a little bit on the girls and women and appearance issue in our book, but it is such a big issue that we literally had to say this is in fact a separate book because we can't do it all. But on the upspeak, it's so interesting, and now I'm always so conscious of that now because we wrote about this in the book, and I think, did I do upspeak? I don't want to, and when I hear it in my daughter, it's hard, but one psychologist at the University of Michigan told us this was his pet peeve, and he would hear it in his female graduate students, and it just drove him nuts. But interestingly, he said it stems from maybe partly Valley Girl, but also women are trying to get people to agree with them. It's part of our style, right? That we want to seek consensus, and we do it even in the way we end sentences. But I think you just have to draw attention to it. And when you point it out, it's really powerful because once you start to notice this stuff, you can correct it. And I think women, my sense is that the younger women are so eager to learn this stuff that it's really powerful to have somebody taking an interest and trying to help.
Along these lines, I wonder how much age and life stage really has an impact on all this confidence. Judging from what you said before, it seems like it would have considerable influence because of this accumulated experience. But what have you seen along those lines in terms of looking at women who are older and more seasoned, let's say, in their career?
We have seen there wasn't a lot of data on women and confidence broken down by age. And so we, with the help of this professor, Dr. Petty, at Ohio State, we've created a confidence assessment that's on our website. It measures your confidence. And it's also giving them an enormous amount of data on women and men in confidence, but broken down by profession and gender and ethnicity and location. So we're not quite ready to publish anything yet, or they're not, but the early results do show that there's a pretty distinct link between age and confidence. For women, male confidence stays at a much more, just in a level place over the course of their lives. But for women, there seems to really be an increase and a high point right around 50, I think it is. It's nice. I'm 52, so feeling so confident, which is great. But there's also a link we found but they don't, in this particular one, they're not so sure what the chicken or the egg issue. There seems to be a link between income level and confidence. But they're not sure. We're trying to figure out how to measure, is it that when you're earning more money, you do feel more confident, or the fact is you're a more confident person, and therefore from the get-go you're more successful, and it all snowballs. So they're trying to sort that out.
I have a whole long list of, being over-prepared. Just, that's another thing we do in terms of compensating for the confidence thing. But I'm going to really be anxious to hear from the audience. Before we do that, I have one more thing I want to pose, and that is, we've talked so much from the individual's perspective of different things that we as women struggle with or we can be working on to improve. What can our employers do? What are some best practices that management at law firms like Kirkland and all across the country in terms of companies and law firms, what can they do to support women's performance, leadership, power, ambition, confidence, all those things? What are some steps that can be done?
We've started to do research on this because there's been so much interest. We've had a lot of organizations come to us and say, what could we be doing specifically on the confidence question? And we found there's some really interesting best practices to think about. I think one of the most obvious in some ways is to think about the review process, because men and women interpret feedback and criticism in incredibly different ways. We had one banker say to us, just casually, and what got us really looking at this, well, I can give a 360 review, the same review results to a man and a woman, and the woman will think she's being told to leave, and the man will think he's doing a great job. And it's really that women we have an ability to seize on the one negative bit in a review and ruminate on it and just blow it to a proportion so we take things in differently, and a lot of companies have said that they're really starting to look at tailoring reviews and understanding the way the feedback is going to be perceived, that's critical. Sitting down and saying, what did you hear me say? What is your takeaway from this? It can be that basic, but it can also get much more complicated. Encouraging risk-taking is critical. And what the data shows is that the earlier you can start to encourage risk-taking for your female employees and getting them to, again, it's very comfortable to stay in our comfort zones, and it can be very comfortable for managers to manage people who are just comfortable where they are. But recognizing that women may not be quite as likely to say, I'm going to stretch and ask for that, and to early on encourage some of that to happen as much as you can. And to we've talked to a number of organizations too that have said to us candidly, they have so few women in really senior positions, they're not eager to put them in risky situations because they don't want anything bad to happen. And so some of the most, talented women aren't really being given the chance to flourish even at the very top. Meeting management is also essential. There are ways to manage meetings. There's a great book, I think that's going to be coming out soon, that Cass Sunstein has written on groupthink and how meetings and groups work together well. But assigning specific roles in meetings instead of letting it just kind of be a survival of the fittest and whoever's the loudest and can talk the longest, because you just actually it's not good management. You're not using your talent very well. And with women, again, give them a role. Say, this is what I think you should do. That empowers them to to do something they might not have thought of ordinarily. And my final anecdote that I love is Google is doing something really interesting. It's called the nudge. And what they found is that because at Google, it's a self-promoting culture. You have to put your own hand up when you think you're ready for a promotion. Of course, they found women were just never really putting their hands up. They were never as ready as the men. So they started sending out electronic reminders. Really all it is just an email saying you should consider asking for a promotion. When they do that, proportionately as many women apply for promotions as men. When they forget to send these reminders, the numbers drop again.
Right.
So just keeping in mind that sometimes as the manager or the company, sometimes it's as simple as a push.
Really interesting.
It's just really a little nudge.
Well, great. And those are so many good nuggets there. And I want to turn it to the audience a little bit, and then I may sneak in a few more questions because I really can't resist. If you would just start with your name and your place of employment, and Rebecca, I'll start with you. And if we don't have a mic, I think I'm going to repeat the question. We do have a mic. Terrific.
Hi, Rebecca Fine. I'm a partner at Schindler, Cohen & Hockman. Paul Tough, in his book How Children Succeed, arrived at a lot of the same conclusions that you did concerning the importance of failure in determining outcomes of children who were ultimately found themselves to be more successful in life. He also considered that optimism was a really important ingredient. And I didn't read your book, and I look forward to it. But to what extent did you find that that was kind of an essential ingredient in the makeup of the confidence code?
So I think optimism is heavily related to confidence. And in fact, what we could, so there's this, we talked about Martin Seligman, and he's done so much research on learned optimism, and I think especially when you're looking at optimism as something, the definition of learned optimism, which really has a lot to do with, I can do this, I have power to make things happen. It's very similar to this definition of confidence, which is what turns our thoughts into action. So there's a real action component to both of them. And ultimately, I think there's a lot of overlap in terms of just the belief that you have the power to affect things. And optimism, it's broad like that. And confidence is about, I think I could do this or that more specifically. But I think that both of those things reinforce each other a lot.
Although, Claire, I want to probe a little bit more on that, because we've talked, and we have a mutual friend, Gretchen Rubin, who really has that similar philosophy, and you push back on that in your book, and you say you guard against this fake it until you make it sort of thing. So could you explain a little bit more about the distinction there?
Well, I think that it's funny, the fake it till you make it is, when we talk to psychologists about that, and it does seem to be such an easy fix, right? Because fake it till you make it, sometimes you have to just get going, right? You need something to get over that initial fear. The initial, what's going to keep us static, and then you got to just jump over it. But for women especially, the fake it till you make it can have the outcome of making us feel even more like frauds. Because when we're telling ourselves literally, okay, now we're faking it, it just doesn't work that well for women in terms of our feeling authentic. And so what we found is that you need to, it's far more powerful to acknowledge, all right, I'm a little frightened now because I'm going to be the only woman speaking in this particular scenario. Recognize that there's a reason you feel that way, that it's normal, that studies show all women would feel that way, and then just decide to act in spite of being afraid. Recognize you're afraid and say, but I'm going to act anyway. And it's not so much about faking it as it is just being conscious of it and moving through it. And the other thing I'll say on that is far more powerful. There's really interesting research about what can be a real boost for women, which is taking the focus off of us. So women this is a great little trick in so many ways. We are far more motivated when we are helping other people, when we're acting on behalf of our organizations or a cause or the group. So if we can reframe whatever it is that's frightening us, whether it's a speech, instead you say, I'm not up here talking about me, I'm actually talking on behalf of the firm or the group, or I'm making a case for what we're all doing. Or you're new to a job, this is what the research was, and you're nervous that you don't have what it takes. Focus on not you and your nerves, but okay, here's how I'm going to help Bob and Susan, because they're never going to get through this stuff today unless I'm doing X. Once we can move our minds there, we tap into a lot more natural confidence.
I think that's absolutely right. I worked with a woman who was up for managing partner at a law firm, and she said the same thing. She said her male colleagues were pushing her to raise her hand for it, and she said, it's so self-aggrandizing. Why do I need to take this on? And they said, well, wait a minute. This is going to be a platform for you to help so many other people be able to do the things that you want to do and do so many good things for this firm. And once they reframed it like that, she stepped up and, of course, really performed. But she needed that reframing for her to get comfortable with that different role. Other questions? Yes, Rosina.
This has been wonderful so far. Thank you. I'm really interested in this issue between the kinds of actions that we can personally take and the sort of societal biases and kind of challenges that we're up against. And so I don't know if you just saw the article that came out a couple of days ago by Sheryl Sandberg and Adam Grant, Speaking While Female. And I just think that, this is a really interesting problem because they seem to be saying, the studies are showing, of course we all know women don't speak up in meetings as often and that sort of thing, but when they do, it's actually a problem. They actually are perceived, more poorly, not perceived as having, given the same kind of quality of ideas and suggestions to the growth or the development of the plan, whatever is being discussed. So, I mean, here we have this problem, and what kind of awareness can we bring? How do we shift, attitudes about that? And I just wanted to say, just as an aside, it reminds me of the conversations we're having about race in the same kind of way too.
Mm-hmm. I mean, essentially, you've raised what is the trickiest issue in all of this, which is that we can change a lot about our confidence level, and there's a lot we can do. But you may be working in a situation where maybe you don't have terrific managers, maybe you don't have bosses who understand what your confidence will look like. There's just so many issues you can still face despite doing what might be the right thing. One other thing we talk about in the book is that, in fact, authenticity and authentic confidence is so important, and that confidence for women might not always look the same way as it does for men, right? It may not, we all kind of, when you visualize what does confidence look like, again, we all kind of go to that cliche of a sort of Mad Men style swagger and, I can handle this and walking through and that's just not, some women are comfortable with that. A lot of women aren't. Some women are going to be confident listeners and analyzers, and somewhat, so, there's a real, and we were talking about this on the phone. I think at the top, there's a lot we can do ourselves. But what needs to happen at the top is a redefinition of what leadership looks like. And that, I think, is something that, as hard as every company you talk to, or we talk to so many CEOs or heads of law firms, and everybody says, we want women. But often they still don't quite recognize that, leadership needs to be redefined to some extent, that it's not about finding women who are going to fit into this mold. It's about changing the mold, because all of the studies show that for diversity to matter and help your business, you actually want diversity. You don't just want a whole lot of people who are exactly the same. And I think it's that piece that you're talking about, which is, what is it with that stuff? Is it that seeming to speak up first or command that people often feel is just missing?
Right, and when we did talk about this, and it relates partly to this issue around best practices, what can we do to broaden the image of a leader? How can we change what a leader looks like? And have you seen companies do that successfully in one way or another?
I think that the most important thing we can do is something that the questioner mentioned, which is just, it's bringing awareness. It's being as transparent about this stuff as possible. It's on a small scale, it's looking at your own strengths, recognizing that, okay, I may not be the person who's going to speak up first all the time or do X, Y, and Z that's going to fit this mold. But if I'm doing this, I'm going to actually make it plain to my superiors that I think I have these strong leadership skills. This is how I'm going to be conducting this meeting, and here's why. I'm going to play this role in this meeting, and let me tell you why, because I actually think it's really, it sometimes almost sounds ham-handed, but I think that it's important to be transparent about the roles we want to play, what we're playing, what's important, because you start to educate people. We found in the conversations we've had just with men and women that even some of the male managers understanding. We were speaking at an event for Marriott recently, and we had a senior executive in the back of the room say, after we had spoke, it's so funny because I had two women recently who I just offered these senior positions to, and both of them within a day of each other told me all the reasons why they were not ready for these jobs. And he said, I have never been more surprised. I just didn't know what to make of it. But then he said, but now that I'm hearing everything you've just talked about, I'm starting to understand what was going on. And I think the more we can have conversations like this and talk about, all right, what is important in terms of leadership, and also press it's an example. When you press the leaders of a company to make it plain what they value in leaders, that really has an important trickle-down effect. So that, I really believe that the more females are speaking, the less speaking when female is going to be a problem. It feels like a problem now because it's just not as common.
Yeah, and I've seen also when there is really a different type of female leader at a company or firm, if that company or firm then really highlights that person and profiles them, that can really be helpful. And I think also clearly in the legal profession in particular, or a client-based profession, when clients are recognizing those female leaders, I mean, that's incredibly compelling because they're driving the business and paying the bills and all that sort of stuff.
Absolutely.
So, other questions, Melinda?
I'm Melinda Marshall. I head up publications for the Center for Talent Innovation, and Debbie, who's partnered with us for a long time, knows well the innovation research that we did, which shows this correlation between inclusive leaders and better innovative outcomes. So that we're making this business case with our research that shows that companies increasingly need to bring to the fore those behaviors, including the self-restraint and the sharing credit for team success and listening to the quietest voice in the room and acting on feedback as the behaviors that coax out the best ideas, the best solutions. So our take is really that we're on the way to fixing leadership to recognize what women bring that's different. But I guess I'm a little concerned about the mixed message here with all of us in this room. If you had pitched a book that were the collaboration code, the art and science of self-restraint, what men should know, I'm guessing no publisher would have picked it up and no men would read it and no men would be in this room. So I'm a little worried about empowering us by telling us we need to fix everything we are, that there is some forward progress in helping leadership perceive the business case toward incorporating women as they bring their self-doubt, as they bring their restraint, as they bring their inclination to not be shooting from the hip. And I hope that's your next book.
I know.
You clearly need more to do, no question.
I'm not sure that book would sell. I think you're right. And I do think you're right. It's important and what we try to make plain in the book is women should not be acting like men. Look, we shouldn't all be slapping on testosterone patches and just, going for it. I think that the trick for us is when we use all of our natural abilities, whether it's the caution, the restraint, the ability to analyze on a daily basis in our jobs, it's hugely useful. But when we turn that lens on ourselves sometimes and use it to analyze our own abilities and what we're ready for and whether we're ready for the next job or promotion, that's where we can be doing ourselves a disservice. And so I think it's recognizing that we are, if there's one thing you walk away with, just knowing that we are constantly underestimating what we're capable of and what we're ready for. And when you know that, just that self-knowledge enables us to say yes to a lot more things. That doesn't mean we should change our operating style, but I think in terms of our own self-evaluation, it's pretty profound. And the other thing that is I think so important, and I hinted at this earlier, but our capacity to ruminate and stew on things is just unmatched. And that can be great, right? It can be great for the company, but it can be just debilitating personally. And I think, and we have some great tips in the book on, again, kind of cognitive behavioral therapy techniques. My favorite, my own worst ruminating moment recently was, I think the book was about to come out and we can all recognize this. I think I'd sent an email to Diane Sawyer about a piece I was supposed to be doing for World News.
We can all relate to that part.
Yeah, well, that part. You can all relate to this. She was my boss at the time. And of course I didn't hear back right away. So within 2 hours I'm thinking, ABC's really mad at me because I'm working on this book and I'm not doing the work I'm supposed to be doing for ABC. And then a day goes by and I haven't heard, and I'm thinking I need to call my agent. Maybe the whole company's mad at me, and then these things go on and on. But really, you can take a situation like that, and it's just the research is so interesting. If you can find one alternative explanation that you can tell yourself. And what I love about the research is it doesn't even have to be a reasonable explanation, right? Anything works. It will change that sort of habitual spinning into something else, whether it's, oh, well, she just got back from a trip or she just did this. So I think of it more as, look, you're right. We shouldn't be just trying to do a wholesale change, but I think it's recognizing where there are areas where confidence would actually just make us feel better. One of the women we interviewed for the book is a Buddhist expert, and she said she thinks of confidence as a kind of energy and an ability to move toward things wholeheartedly. And I thought, gosh, when do I do that? Without holding back. That is just such a great, it just was such a great image for me, and still a little bit aspirational, I have to say. But.
And I think that subject Melinda raised really can pervade so many issues that women discuss. I mean, the one that comes most readily to mind to me is this queen bee syndrome. Should we outwardly be talking about issues when women are not supporting women? And a lot of us don't want to go there because we don't want to out the issue and create, some sort of fueled stereotype and things. But again, in my mind, these are issues that are out there. They're more than anecdotal. And if a lot of us are empowered by information and can laugh really at ourselves in some respects about how ridiculous this thing is that we're ruminating about, it can be affirming, and ideally we'll use that. And I can attest, having read the book, that really it gives you all those things, and you sort of find yourself giggling like, oh, I thought that too, how ridiculous, So, yeah. Other questions? I'm trying to, your name, sorry. I know where you're from. Yes, Encore.
Same law school.
That's right. Welcome.
Yeah, from encore.org. I have two daughters who are in college, so this is a subject that's near and dear to my heart. One is in a co-ed college, and one is at a very good women's college. And when she chose the women's college, what she said to me was, the reason I've chosen this college is because I want to develop more confidence. So she's a freshman now. She's been there for a few months. And I've been really struck about the scaffolding of expectations and just more accountability for these women. And things like the fact that even though 2% of the college students in the country have come from women's colleges, something like 20-something% are in the legislature. She's now struggling with whether she wants to stay. For a whole host of reasons. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are, or what the data says about the impact of these kinds of institutions on women after they get out of them.
Well, there is good data, both on all-girls schools and colleges about those being particularly rich and supportive environments for success and for confidence building, and for women just feeling, again, a little more empowered to take risks. It's funny, we did do some stories or some reporting, I guess, with some Georgetown students, some of whom said they had been to all-girls schools as high school students and found the transition really difficult. That they found that, they were so used to speaking up all the time, and then they would look around in these classes and realize, well, in college, the girls weren't speaking up as much, and they started to slowly fall back into the shadows a little bit, which I thought was sad. But I think that it's, I don't know what the case is for your daughter in particular, but they can just be incredible environments. At some point you do have to make the transition, right? Because we're not in an all-girl world. But I think that the early experience is really powerful, and the data does back that up. Exactly what you said in terms of success in obvious ways.
Just a related issue I just want to raise with you. We talked about this before. Anna Fels has done some great research around women and ambition, and you talk about ambition in the book. And I wonder what you see as really the interplay of those two things, and more importantly, how do we make sure that both confidence and ambition are not dirty words for women?
You know, it's interesting. Some of the research shows that, and I don't know whether this will change over time. It will be interesting just looking at the work you're doing, but women are often driven by very different values. There's really interesting research that shows women have, in the workplace, can still have very different values than men have. We will value, for example, just the working dynamic among our colleagues. We'll value the mission of the company. We'll value what our work is doing and say. I mean, we often value many more things than men do, who often tend to value more status and pay, right? So it's just a clearer definition in terms of this is an important job for me. And, I don't think it's clear yet from the research whether, so some of you could look at ambition. Well, how do you measure ambition, right? Because I think some men or male bosses will find it perplexing, the choices women will make, when it's not always about the bottom line. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, there's still not a lot of research as to whether that's shifting, and the more women are running companies, maybe our values will start to change. But I do think there's a sense of community values that women often bring to the table, and I think that's mistakenly viewed as a lack of ambition. Right. And I don't think that's always the case.
Other questions in the back? Yes. The gentleman in the back. Feels good to say that.
The gentleman in the back.
You're the only one where I'm talking to you.
Hi there. My name is Ari Joseph. I'm from Fried Frank. You had mentioned before that women are oftentimes perfectionists, and that you shouldn't necessarily be perfectionists. For example, you said perhaps not turning in an assignment when you think it's complete. I'm curious if you would give that same advice to women of color in the workplace.
I don't know. I think it's, I think that women in general, and we didn't see, a big difference in terms of perfectionism. In our study so far, this study I was talking about from Ohio State, interestingly, although we're trying to increase the sample size, it is pretty big. In terms of women and ethnicity, African American women show more confidence than Caucasian women, who show more confidence than Asian American women. So I don't know, we don't know what to make of that, really, but it's interesting to us. I think we have different sections in the book where we talk to African American women about the different struggles, because you sort of have the double minority issue, and how you're just constantly aware at every moment what everybody is thinking about you when you walk into a room, and what judgments are being made. But, I still think that we as women, whatever our color, we're still dealing with often issues of this need to be perfect and to please everybody. And I think that it's not that I'm saying to people, don't do a good job, all right? Because I have had these situations before where people say, but that's, especially in the legal profession, this is why we're good. If there's one place where we need to get everything perfect and 110% perfect, it's in the legal profession. I'm saying, yeah, but you don't need to be 130% perfect. So I think part of it is not saying just do an okay job on something. It's recognizing when you've done a good enough job, and you can turn your attention to something else that's going to increase your value. So I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I would say that for all women, we need to learn to recognize when we can move on from something and it's good enough.
Right. In the back, yes. If you just speak into the mic,
thanks.
yes.
I was just curious, you mentioned a little bit about brain chemistry and testosterone and hormones, and I'm wondering if any of the research shows anything about sort of women and aging and sort of post-menopause, post-kids out of the house. Is there hope?
Right. You know what? It's
60's
funny.
going to be great.
Yes, yeah, exactly. That's the headline. I do not know that. I do know from what we've seen that our confidence does increase, and we hit a good point, sort of 40s, 50s. but I haven't seen anything on menopause and confidence and hormones that directly relates to what we're looking at with confidence. But that would be another really interesting area of study, definitely.
Marina?
Yes, I just wanted to flip this conversation slightly, and this is, I think, similar to some of the initial comments I heard. So I think probably many of us in the room are not wallflowers, and while we internally second-guess ourselves, we probably feel comfortable speaking up in meetings. And I think then we have the further challenge of making sure that our male colleagues don't feel threatened by that confidence. And I haven't read your book, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about if you are a fairly confident woman in a largely male organization, how do you make your male colleagues comfortable with your competence and your confidence? Because I think there is still very much a prevalence of men preferring to see women in a particular role. And I'll give you a small example of that. I recently took an older male colleague out for his retirement. And I asked him for some advice about careers. And he had, generally good things to say, at the end of which he said, but when you sing, because I have, sung in the past at the organization, you transform yourself into this, very serious person, into this, and it was very clear to me that, as an older man, he preferred to see a woman in kind of a different role than one, having views and opinions and kind of bossing people around, so.
And I want to just follow up on Marina's question and also ask, should we be concerned with that? Her question really is, how do we get men to be comfortable with our confidence, but also should we be focused on that? And is that a real deliberate focus we should have?
I mean, I've been struck by, again, I'm repeating myself, and sorry about that, but that the more we can include men in conversations like this one, the better. And in fact, I really think that, I don't think women's initiatives don't make sense, but I think they have got to start to include a lot of men, because these, I don't know, there are a couple men in the room, but when the reaction we've had when men hear this is sometimes they're surprised at a lot of it. They don't, understanding that women would ruminate on things or stick on, there's just stuff that you think is understood, but it's really not. And so I think the more we can have conversations, and especially about what leadership looks like, including men, the better. And I think that a certain amount of educating, as much as we can educate and be evangelists, it's very useful, and not in a way that's just divisive. Why is this as much as we can do it in a way that is around areas not where there are problems, but when there aren't problems, and sort of try to make these conversations broader. But I'll also say that I think that there is some of this stuff that we just have to get through. I mean, I think sometimes we just have to realize that you're right. As Debbie said, people might not like us. They might not like our style. They might not like the way our voices sound, and but we're even in this, I find, and I get this question from so many women, where everybody's looking for the perfect path, especially young women. Well, should I do this? But if I do this, then this will happen. If I do this, that might happen. I say, you know what? Sometimes it's just not going to work out. And sometimes you're going to make people mad. Sometimes you're going to have a bad boss. And but you just have to keep going, because remember, you're doing this for the next generation, right? We're not there yet. And so understanding, again, even in this situation, there's going to be failure, I think, is important.
Right. And I think, but your point, Marina, really raises another real issue that comes up regularly for women, is this fine line, like you say. It's really, the imposter syndrome you said before, and there's this,
Right.
many women are kind of riddled with self-doubt,
Right.
but don't want to go on the other end of the spectrum of being obnoxious self-promoters. So I think that's part of what Marina is getting at as well, is really is there direction on that fine line that you've seen that women have done successfully, where they've properly taken credit where credit is due, but not been overly offensive in doing so?
I know it is like the, tap dancing backwards thing that women are, there's a really interesting study out of Stanford that talks about the most effective leaders for this century and what the attributes they have, and it's a mix of traditionally male and female attributes and management qualities. and that the people who are best able to meld those things together are women right now. So women, the women who really can kind of straddle this thing are the people who can really benefit. But of course it's not easy, and it does involve, it involves things where women tend to be naturally good at, which is judging the way people react to us, understanding that this person, and all that stuff, which sometimes just gets exhausting,
yeah.
right? You're just feeling like, yet again, you're having to manage all of these personalities. And so I think for all of us, we just have to decide, how important is that person to my career, right? And how much do I really need to do that? Because some of that does still exist. You're absolutely right.
Your hand has been up a number of times. Yes.
I was beginning to think you were testing my confidence.
Oh, I wouldn't dare.
I'm Sarah Todd. I'm Associate General Counsel at Fannie Mae. I have a substantive question, but first a quick yes or no question. Did you begin to learn Russian from Господин Pashevich at Worthington High School?
No, but I did go to Worthington High School.
Okay, well, I had heard that, and I thought that must be where you got started.
Interesting.
Sorry. Anyway, didn't mean to digress. No, I do have a substantive question. It relates to the earlier comment that we can't just expect everyone to succeed by turning into clones of what people expect men to be. But I think it's very important for people not so much to change as to understand that there are different ways of being and there are different perspectives on these things, and that whatever they do or say is going to be judged perhaps from a different perspective than they would judge. And the reason that I'm asking the question is that I look back on my lengthy legal career and I can think of many times where questions were asked where my answers were substantively different from those of my male colleagues. And I wonder whether it's because I define honesty and truth differently than they do. If you went to the men who
Very
who
diplomatic, the way you're saying that.
I mean, but think about it. I mean, if you went to the men who are supposedly exaggerating their competence by 30%, they would never say that they are lying. And even if you really push them on it, they believe they are telling the truth.
Right.
So how could my resume and another guy's resume, who are virtually identical, indicate that he's 30% more competent than I am, and yet both of us can be telling the truth? Or when I look back on my early days as an associate in private practice, where I knew I was working just as hard as my male colleagues, but at the end of the year when they started to look at who reported how many hours on their timesheets, mine were significantly lower.
I mean, this gets back to the data right at the beginning of our talk, which is that it is a natural bias that, for the most part, it just breaks down along gender lines, that women are much more, we just have this sense of, it's almost as though, I came to think of it through all the research, that we almost see hyper reality, right? I mean, we see hyper reality with a kind of critical view, and especially of ourselves, that again, it's too critical. So our truth is almost, we're too tough on ourselves. Our truth isn't the truth either. And this sort of the kind of overestimating of ability is, again, it's not bravado. It's just a sense of almost that, sure, but I can do that. And so what's the, and somewhere in the middle, I think, is a great place to be. But it's, I know, I find it fascinating. I really do.
We have time for one more question. Yes. Deborah.
Hi, I'm Deborah Stair, and I currently have my own practice. But another thing that I found is that while we might be underconfident in some of the things we do, we tend to be overconfident in our own judgments of the situation. And just an example of that was, this was one job a long time ago where, my male colleagues would all run out the door to the train, but I was always the last one. And I would always get the call to do something, and I thought that was so wonderful that I was always the one, I'm indispensable. And at the end of the day, and I won't say all it came out that, you know, my boss thought that my male colleagues were more efficient than I was because they left at 5 and I didn't. And I learned so much from that because I had in my mind the way I thought my actions were being perceived, and I was completely wrong, you know, in that. And I learned a lot from that. So that was a failure, obviously, that I learned from. But it also made me realize that while we can be very flexible and, you know, non-judgmental, we also create a reality, like you said, where we choose maybe the worst possible way to interpret something or the worst possible world to live in and then just stick with it without, you know, noticing that we're even doing it.
Yeah, and it is true, the issue of that we think that people will notice, right? That's the other thing. We just think if we're working hard and we're doing this stuff that somehow somebody is finally going to say, aha, I see what you've been doing and therefore you should. And I think that's another area where we can learn and say, you know what, no, I think we just have to go sort of knock on the supervisor's doors and say, hey, let me just tell you what I've been doing, because they're not paying attention. They're really not usually, you know, so it really, it's helpful to remember that.
Very quickly, Naria, really quick.
Sorry,
yes.
I've been trying the whole time. Okay, so I actually worked at ABC for 10 years, and I now do media training and presentational training. So I work with lots of people exactly on these topics. But I have 3 young girls, 10-year-old, 7, and 4. So this is very near and dear. But as parents now, what we're reading, it was in the Times even this weekend, is that it's not about confidence and that it's actually harmful. They don't say, boys and girls, to tell your children, you're good at math or you're good at reading. You're supposed to say it's all about the effort, right? That all this focus is now on effort. And then you talk about this study from Berkeley, which is that actually coming in confident can be a real asset. So it's a bit confusing, and particularly as a mother of girls, to think about how you straddle this correctly, because I do obviously want to raise 3 very confident girls, but I've been really focused now on when they come home and they get 100 on a test saying, well, that's because you put in a good effort, you know? and honestly, sometimes it's just because they happen to be good at that subject or whatever, and they might have put in very little effort, but it's... So I really am struggling now with, there's so much research, right?
It is, I know,
I mean,
well, that's true.
So,
and all of the research plays, it's awful for women, right? It's just like kind of like, no, there's more stuff that we can
to ruminate about.
Yeah, because now I think, and my daughter will sometimes say, well, I'm good at that, and I'll think, no, you're not, you know, you're not good at that. I mean, what?
Well, I do think that so this part of it is a definitional thing because again, you can't make someone confident by saying you're good at this. So if you sit around the whole time and say you're good, you're great, you're wonderful. So that's the whole sort of self-esteem, that whole self-esteem bubble that we were just in, which is it's false self-esteem, because then they believe all of this stuff and the trophies, and then suddenly they're in the real world and no boss is sitting around saying, oh, you're just so great, just like your parents always told you. It's like, no, you got to do stuff. And so, but I think that's where this definition of confidence, I mean, I think part of it is about working and mastering. So anytime you can point out, look, you have studied, maybe in some cases they haven't, but anytime they can, they've worked hard at something and overcome an obstacle and then achieved something, that's actually going to help them build real confidence, which is useful. Okay. And I think that's when they say, praise the praise the process effort, or the effort, and it's not about the end result. But I think, the end result does matter if they've finally spent time and mastered something. But I know it can be a little bit overwhelming. I agree.
So Claire, we've talked about a whole host of issues, and we're going to wrap up in just a moment. But I just wanted to know, is there a parting word here? Is there something that either we needed to get out there that you want to make sure the audience leaves with, or something you really want to underscore that we addressed?
I think, well, first of all, I really do think that if you just constantly remember in almost every circumstance where you're evaluating yourself, you're probably aiming too low. So Jessica, you're probably judging yourself a little bit more harshly. If we just remember that our meter is off. And I guess the other thing I would say is was a wonderful anecdote that, and it's about female leadership that Christine Lagarde told us. She was just an incredible interview for the book and really helped us understand the importance of authenticity and confidence for women. And again, this issue of women, we shouldn't be striving to be doing things exactly the way men do. But she said she was advising a leader of a third world country, a woman, because there aren't that many women to give advice when you're around, and Christine Lagarde happens to be one of them. And this woman was getting a lot of criticism because her country is broke, and she decided she was going to cut the size of the presidential motorcade in half because she thought, why do we need 20 cars? I think 10 is enough. She immediately just got loads of criticism. You don't look presidential. Why are you doing this? Even from supporters. And Christine Lagarde told us, and I thought this was counterintuitive. She said, no, I told her to stick with it, and she should just dare the difference and not even, and make an issue of it. She should embrace it as an issue and explain why she's doing it and why that is something she feels passionately about. And I think that really resonated with us in terms of just, owning, when we talked about this transparency and having to, own what is different and what we're doing differently and try to be transparent about it. Don't hide, and try to hide it, and really just think about what authenticity and what your authentic confidence really is and what it looks like.
So with that, I really want to thank you, Claire. You're such an inspiration, really.
Thank you very much.
I also really want to thank Kirkland again, and forgive me, but I have to mention all these names because the people who made today happen are just tremendous and deserve acknowledgement. Linda Myers, Rena Alvarez, Beth Weiner, Jennifer Morgan, Rajinder Basi, Aya O'Connor, Al Porteous, Patty Messinik, Maria Black, Kate Slasted, Audra Simmel, Natalie Conkle, Kim Matthews, Andrew Johnson, and Renee Newell, who I know is my colleague, who I know so many of you corresponded with. The other thing I want to say is Finding Bliss, Innovative Legal Models for Happy Clients and Happy Lawyers, as Linda mentioned, came out last week. We're really excited about it, and actually our next event of this sort for Law and Reorder will again be at Kirkland on March 3rd, and I'm excited to announce that Anne Marie Slaughter, who wrote the book's foreword, will be doing an interview of me for the book. So I really hope you will all come to that. And again, I want to thank Claire and say I hope to see a more confident version of all of you on March 3rd. Thank you.
That was great.